The alarm panel above the airlock blinked red, and my hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the box. Inside that box was a cake. A stupid, lopsided chocolate cake with uneven frosting, sitting in a supply crate meant for medical rations. If anyone scanned it properly, I was finished. Not fired, finished. The kind of finished where they space you out an airlock and never mention your name again. My heart slammed against my ribs as the docking clamp released with a hiss, and the cargo shuttle shuddered forward into the shadow of the largest ship I had ever seen in my life. The Sovereign's Requiem. Even the name sounded like a warning. It filled the entire viewport, black and silver, curved like something between a blade and a coffin, stretching so far that our little shuttle looked like a crumb drifting toward a mountain. Lights blinked along its hull in slow funeral rhythm, on and off, like a heartbeat that had forgotten how to be excited about anything. I had never been this close to it before. Nobody had, not without an official summons. And I did not have one. "Ethan, you can still turn back," said Nathan Price through my earpiece. He was the only reason I had gotten this far, sneaking me a docking clearance code he was absolutely not supposed to have. His voice was tight with nerves. "I mean it. Turn the shuttle around right now, and I can still delete the log before anyone checks it." "I'm not turning back," I said, gripping the box tighter. "Do you understand what happens if her guards catch a human standing where you're about to stand? They don't arrest people, Ethan. They don't have a word for arrest in their language. They have a word for ending." "I know. Then why are you doing this?" I looked down at the cake, frosting already sliding slightly to one side from the vibration of the shuttle engines, and I thought about the conversation that had started all of this, only hours ago, in a mess hall 3 decks below a station, that suddenly felt very far away and very safe. Someone had mentioned, almost like it was nothing, almost like it was a weather report, that today marked 200 years since Empress Sorrentha Vale took her throne. 200 years since the day her entire family was wiped from existence in a single night, and she alone survived to rule the ashes. And in 200 years, not one single person, in her entire empire, had ever wished her a happy birthday. Not because they forgot, because they were afraid. The shuttle rocked as the docking arm caught our hull, and metal groaned as we were pulled inside a hangar bay the size of a small city. Rows of black fighters sat in perfect silence, their pilots nowhere in sight, as if even the machines were too disciplined to make unnecessary noise. "Ethan," Nathan's voice had dropped low, urgent. "I've got a visual on your bay. There are 3 guards standing at the loading ramp, armed. They're not supposed to be there for a supply run this small. Maybe it's routine. Nothing on that ship is routine. Nothing has been routine there for 2 centuries. The ramp lowered with a slow mechanical sigh, and cold air rushed into the shuttle, carrying the strange metallic scent that all Vantheon ships seem to have, like old machinery and rain on stone. I picked up the crate, tucked it against my side like it was the most normal thing in the world, and walked down the ramp on legs that did not feel entirely like my own. The 3 guards turned toward me the instant my boots touched the deck. They were tall, taller than any human, with skin like brushed silver, and eyes the pale blue of a winter sky. Their armor was matte black, edged with thin lines of glowing silver that pulsed faintly, almost like a second heartbeat layered over their own. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. The weapons in their hands did all the talking. "Cargo delivery," I said, forcing my voice to stay level. "Medical supplies for Deck 14. The nearest guard tilted his head, studying me the way you might study an insect that had wandered somewhere it clearly did not belong. His eyes moved from my face to the crate in my arms, and for one horrifying second I thought he could smell the frosting through the plastic seal. "Human," he said finally, the word coming out flat, almost curious. "Humans do not deliver cargo to this vessel. Humans do not board this vessel at all." "There was a shortage," I said. "Station command sent me. I have clearance." It was a lie, and a bad one, but sometimes the trick to lying is not making the lie perfect. It is making the lie boring enough that nobody wants to spend the effort checking it. Guards who have stood at the same post for years, decades, sometimes centuries, do not always want to be the one who starts an incident over a stack of medical crates. The guard's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a long moment nobody moved. My pulse was so loud in my own ears I was certain he could hear it too. Then he stepped aside. "Deck 14 is that direction." he said, gesturing down a long corridor lit by cold blue light. You have 20 minutes before I report an unauthorized presence. Understood, I said, and I walked past him, before my legs could remember how frightened they were supposed to be. The corridor swallowed me whole. It was silent, in a way I had never experienced before. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a place where sound itself had learned to behave. My footsteps echoed against polished black floors, and every few meters, alcoves in the walls held statues, tall silver figures with their heads bowed, their hands folded, as if the entire ship had been built as one long memorial. Ethan, Nathan whispered in my ear, so quiet I almost missed it. You're heading the wrong way. Deck 14 is behind you. I know. Then where are you going? I stopped in front of a junction where the corridor split into 3 directions, one marked with symbols I recognized from my studies of Vanthian architecture, a symbol that meant something close to sanctum, or throne, or seat of the crown. My throat tightened. I'm going to see the Empress, I said. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. You're going to get us both killed, Nathan finally said. Maybe, I admitted. But somebody has to say it, Nathan. 200 years. 200 birthdays, and nobody has ever once told her happy birthday. Not because she doesn't deserve it. Because everyone is too scared to remember she's still a person, underneath that armor and that throne. She stopped being just a person a long time ago, Ethan. That's the whole point. That's why everyone is scared. I thought about that as I turned down the corridor marked with the symbol for sanctum, the cake growing heavier in my arms with every step, though I knew it hadn't actually changed weight at all. Everyone still has birthdays, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. Even empresses, even the ones nobody remembers to celebrate. The corridor sloped downward, the cold blue light shifting slowly into a deeper shade, almost violet, and the statues along the walls grew taller, older, more worn at the edges, as if this section of the ship had existed far longer than the rest. I passed through an archway carved with symbols I could not read, and the air grew colder still, carrying with it a silence so complete it felt like walking through water. Somewhere ahead of me, past 2 more junctions and what I guessed was a checkpoint I had not yet been stopped at, only because nobody expected anyone foolish enough to try, was a throne room that had not heard a single word of celebration in 2 centuries. I adjusted my grip on the crate, feeling the shape of the cake shift slightly inside it, and I kept walking, because someone had to. Behind me, faint and distant, I heard the sound of boots, many boots, moving fast. My 20 minutes were already running out. I picked up my pace, moving deeper into the violet light, and the sound of boots behind me grew louder, closer, more organized. Whoever they were not wandering, they were hunting. Ethan, they've flagged your access code, Nathan said, his voice cracking with panic now. Security just pulled the shuttle manifest. They know a human is loose on Deck 3, heading toward the Sanctum wing. You need to get out of there right now. I can't. You can. Turn around. Go back to the hangar. Tell them you got lost. Maybe they let you go with a warning. They don't give warnings, Nathan. You told me that yourself. He didn't have an answer for that. The corridor ahead opened into a wide chamber, empty except for a single guard station built into the far wall, a raised platform, where 2 more silver-skinned soldiers stood at perfect attention, spears of dark energy crackling faintly at the tips of their weapons. The moment I stepped into the chamber, both of them turned toward me at once, moving with a synchronized precision that made my stomach twist. Halt, one of them said, his voice carrying an authority that made the single word feel louder than a shout. State your designation and your purpose for entering the sanctum approach. I stopped walking, forcing myself to stand still, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. My name is Ethan Cole, I said. I'm a technician from Meridian Station. I came here to see the Empress. Both guards went very still. You came here, the second guard repeated slowly, to see the Empress. Yes. Do you have a summons? No. Do you have an appointment, a writ of audience, a diplomatic credential of any kind that would explain your presence in this section of the vessel? No, I said again, and I felt my own voice shake slightly, but I kept my chin up anyway. I have a cake. For a long moment, neither guard said anything at all. I watched their eyes flick toward the crate in my arms, then back to my face, as if they were waiting for me to laugh, to admit this was some kind of joke, some kind of test they had not been briefed on. "You will surrender the container," the first guard said finally, extending one gloved hand. "It will be scanned for threats before any further action is taken." I hesitated only a second before handing it over. There was nothing dangerous inside it. Just flour, sugar, chocolate, and a shaky attempt at frosting that Laura Bennett had helped me pipe into something resembling a decorative border only 2 hours earlier, back on the station, back when this whole plan still felt like something I could talk myself out of. The guard ran a small scanning device over the crate, its surface lighting up with pale readings that meant nothing to me. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, just slightly, a fraction of tension easing from his shoulders. "It is food," he said, sounding almost baffled by his own conclusion. "Baked confection. No weapon signature. No biological hazard." "I told you," I said. "It's a cake." "Why?" the second guard asked, and for the first time his voice carried something other than cold authority, something closer to genuine confusion. Would a human bring a baked confection aboard the Sovereign's Requiem? I took a breath. "Because today is the day Empress Sorrentha Vale took the throne," I said. 200 years ago today, and in 200 years, nobody has ever once told her happy birthday. I think that's wrong. I think somebody should. So I made a cake, and I came here to say it myself. The silence that followed was different from every silence I had experienced on this ship so far. It was not the practiced, disciplined silence of soldiers standing at their posts. It was the silence of two people who had genuinely never considered the possibility that I was describing, and did not know what to do with the thought, now that it had been placed in front of them. "You will not reach the throne room," the first guard said slowly, though his certainty sounded thinner than before. "The sanctum is protected by an inner detail that will not hesitate the way we have." "Then I'll ask them the same thing I asked you. They will kill you before you finish the sentence." "Maybe," I said, "but at least I'll have tried. At least she'll know somebody remembered." Behind me, the sound of boots I had heard earlier finally caught up, and I turned to see 4 more guards enter the chamber at a fast, controlled pace, weapons already raised, eyes locking onto me with an intensity that made my knees weak. "Unauthorized human located," one of them said into a comm device at his collar. "Deck 3, Sanctum approach. Requesting orders." There was a burst of static, then a voice on the other end, distant and clipped. I couldn't make out the words, but I watched the guard's expression change as he listened, his jaw tightening. "Understood," he said finally, and lowered his weapon slightly, though not all the way. He looked at me with something that might have been curiosity, might have been pity. "You are to be brought before the court. The voice of the crown wishes to see the human who dared this foolishness in person, before judgment is passed." My stomach dropped. "The voice of the crown?" "Counselor Vesa Orin," the guard said. "First advisor to Empress Sorrentha Vale for the last 180 years. She will decide whether you live long enough to reach the throne room at all." I swallowed hard, but I nodded, because there was nothing else left to do. 2 guards flanked me on either side, close enough that I could feel the faint heat radiating from their armor, and together we moved through another set of doors, into a corridor that curved upward in a long, slow spiral. Walls lined with murals depicting battles I did not recognize. Faces of Vantheon rulers long dead, their eyes painted with an expression of permanent, unreachable sorrow. "You should be afraid," one of the guards said quietly as we walked, his voice pitched low enough that it felt almost like a kindness. "Counselor Orin does not tolerate disruptions to the court's order. She has ended lives for far smaller offenses than what you are attempting." "I'm plenty afraid," I admitted. "I just decided being afraid wasn't a good enough reason to stop." The guard said nothing to that, but something in the set of his shoulders told me my answer had surprised him. We reached a set of towering doors carved from a black metal I did not recognize, etched with symbols that seemed to shift slightly in the corner of my vision whenever I tried to look at them directly. 2 more guards stood at either side, and between them stood a Vantheon woman, unlike any I had seen so far, tall and severe, her silver skin marked with fine lines of gold that traced patterns down the side of her face like frozen rivers of light. Her eyes were the color of a storm about to break. "So," she said, her voice cutting through the corridor like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. "This is the human who believes he can walk uninvited into the presence of the crown. Counselor Orin," the lead guard said, bowing his head slightly. "He carries no weapon, only a baked confection, and a claim that he means to wish the Empress well on the anniversary of her ascension." Vesa Orin's eyes fixed on me, and I felt the weight of 180 years of court politics, secrets, and quiet, careful survival pressing down on me all at once. "Do you have any understanding," she said slowly, "of what today truly is, of what happened on this exact day, 2 centuries past?" "I know her family was killed," I said, my voice quieter now, more careful. "I know she took the throne, because there was nobody else left. I don't know the details, but I know that grief shouldn't mean nobody is ever allowed to say happy birthday to her again. Not forever, not for 200 years straight." Something moved behind Vesa Orin's eyes, some old, buried thing I couldn't name, gone as quickly as it appeared. "You know nothing," she said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "The day her family died was not a tragedy that simply happened to her. It was a betrayal, carried out by those closest to the crown, on the very night of her coronation feast, while music still played in these halls, and the empire believed itself at peace. She has not permitted celebration in this court since, because the last time joy filled these halls, it was the last sound her family ever heard before the blades came." The words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I said nothing at all. "That's exactly why somebody should have said something a long time ago," I finally managed. "Not to erase what happened, just so she knows she's not still standing alone in that same silence 200 years later." Vesa Orin studied me for a long, unreadable moment, the golden lines along her face catching the dim light of the corridor. "You are either the bravest creature I have encountered in a century," she said at last, "or the most foolish." "Probably both," I admitted. A faint, almost imperceptible sound escaped her, something that might, in a kinder century, have been the beginning of a laugh, quickly suppressed. "Very well," she said, turning toward the great black doors behind her. "You wish to stand before the Empress uninvited. I will grant you that much, human, but know this. Whatever happens beyond these doors, I will not be able to protect you from it. Once they open, your fate belongs entirely to her." The doors began to part, releasing a slow breath of cold air, scented faintly with metal and old candle smoke, and beyond them stretched a darkness so vast and so silent that it felt less like a room and more like the inside of a held breath, 2 centuries long, waiting to finally be released. I tightened my grip on the crate, feeling my own heartbeat hammering against my ribs, and stepped forward into the dark. The throne room did not look like a room at all. It looked like the inside of a cathedral built for silence itself, a space so vast that the ceiling disappeared somewhere far above me, lost in shadow and threads of pale blue light that drifted downward like slow-falling snow. Rows of Vantheon nobles stood along either side of a long black path leading toward a raised platform at the far end, each of them dressed in dark, formal robes, each of them turning to stare at me the moment my footsteps echoed against the polished floor. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. 200 pairs of eyes followed me in complete, suffocating silence as I walked forward, the crate held tightly against my chest, my legs carrying me forward on nothing but stubborn will. At the end of the path, on a throne carved from black stone veined with threads of pale silver light, sat Empress Sorrentha Vale. She was not what I expected. I had built an image in my mind of some towering, monstrous figure, cold and inhuman, but the woman on that throne looked almost impossibly still, draped in dark ceremonial robes edged with faded silver embroidery, her pale eyes fixed on some distant point far beyond the walls of the room. Her face bore no visible age, the way most Vantheon nobility seemed frozen somewhere between youth and permanence, but there was something ancient in the way she held herself, something worn down to its final hardened edge. She did not look at me until I was less than 20 paces away. When she finally did, the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. "Explain," she said, and her voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it more frightening than shouting ever could have been. "Why a human stands in my court, uninvited, unsummoned, and unafraid of the consequences that should already be closing around his throat." Every guard in the room shifted subtly, weapons ready, waiting only for a single word from her to end this, before I could finish another sentence. I forced myself to keep my voice steady. "My name is Ethan Cole," I said. "I work as a technician on Meridian Station. I came here because today is your Ascension Day, 200 years since you took this throne, and nobody, in 200 years, has ever wished you a happy birthday." A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the assembled nobles, quickly silenced by a single sharp glance from Counselor Orin, who had entered behind me, and now stood near one of the towering black pillars, watching everything, with an expression I could not read. The Empress did not move. For a long, terrible moment, she simply stared at me, and I felt certain that this silence would be the last thing I ever experienced, that the guards would strike before she even finished deciding how she felt about my intrusion. "You believe," she said finally, her voice dropping even lower, "that a baked confection and a foolish sentence could undo 2 centuries of what this day represents to me." "No," I said, and somehow my voice did not break, though every part of me wanted it to. "I don't think anything can undo what happened to you. I'm not trying to erase it. I just think it's wrong that an entire empire has spent 200 years treating your birthday like something shameful, something that has to be hidden away and never spoken of, instead of treating it like a day that belongs to you. You know nothing of what this day means," she said, and for the first time, something sharp entered her voice, something that cut through the room, like a blade drawn from its sheath. "You know nothing of the music that played in this very hall, 200 years ago, while my family sat at the coronation feast, believing themselves safe among those they trusted most. You know nothing of the moment that music stopped, replaced by the sound of blades and screams, and the silence that followed, once everyone I had ever loved lay dead upon this floor, while I alone was spared, dragged to this very throne by the same hands that had murdered everyone around me, so that the Empire would have a face to rally behind." Her words fell into the room, like stones dropped into still water, spreading outward in slow, silent ripples. I felt my own throat tighten, my eyes stinging despite everything. "I didn't know the details," I admitted quietly. "I'm sorry. I didn't know it happened like that." "Then you understand nothing," she said, "of why joy has no place in this hall on this day, why laughter has not echoed here in 200 years, why every soul in this room has learned, through decades of careful silence, never to speak the words you have just spoken to me." Around me, several of the nobles shifted uncomfortably, and I noticed more than one of them lower their eyes to the floor, as if my words had touched something they themselves had buried too deep to look at directly. "Maybe that's exactly the problem," I said, and I felt something steady settle into my chest, despite the danger all around me. "Maybe 200 years of silence hasn't actually honored what happened to you. Maybe it's just let the people who did that to you win a little more, every single year, by making sure you're still alone in it, even now, even after all this time." The Empress rose from her throne. The movement was slow, deliberate, and every guard in the room straightened instantly, weapons lifting in perfect unison, ready for whatever command might follow. I felt my heartbeat pounding so hard, I thought it might be visible through my chest.
"You dare," she said, descending the first step of the platform, "to stand in the very hall where my family was murdered, and tell me that my grief has been wasted."
"I'm not saying your grief was wasted," I said quickly, my voice trembling now despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "I'm saying grief and joy aren't supposed to cancel each other out. Where I come from, humans have lost entire cities, entire generations, more times than anyone likes to count. And every single time, somewhere in the middle of all that loss, people still found a reason to light a candle, sing an off-key song, share a slice of something sweet, and remember that they were still alive to do it. Not because they'd forgotten what they lost, because remembering what they lost is exactly why they refused to stop living." The Empress stopped 2 steps above me, close enough now that I could see the pale, ancient sorrow etched into every line of her face, close enough to see the exact moment something in her eyes flickered, just barely, like a candle, catching wind, for the first time in centuries. "You speak as though grief is something that can simply be set beside happiness," she said, quieter now, "as though the two are not opposites." "They're not opposites," I said. "I think they're just 2 different ways of loving something you're not ready to let go of." The silence that followed was different from every other silence in that room. It stretched long enough that I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears, long enough that somewhere behind me, I heard Counselor Oren release a breath she had clearly been holding since the moment those great black doors first opened. "Guards," the Empress said finally, and my stomach dropped through the floor, certain those next words would be my last. "Stand down." A wave of stunned silence rippled through the entire hall, weapons lowered, slowly, uncertainly, as if the guards themselves could not quite believe the command they had just received. The Empress turned her pale eyes back to me, and for the first time, I saw something in them that was not cold, not distant, not carved from 2 centuries of practiced sorrow. I saw something small, and human, and impossibly tired, buried underneath layers of crown and grief and duty. "You brought a confection," she said, her voice carrying a strange, careful edge, as though she were testing the shape of the words in her mouth, for the first time in longer than I could imagine. "Show me." My hands were shaking as I knelt, setting the crate down on the cold black floor and lifting the lid. Inside sat the cake, slightly crooked from the shuttle ride, its frosting smudged along one edge where it had shifted during the flight. A single line of small, unevenly piped letters across the top that Laura had insisted on adding at the very last moment, against my protests that there wasn't enough time. "Happy birthday, Sorrentha." The Empress stared at those words for a long, long moment, and in that silence, I realized every single person in that vast hall was holding their breath along with me, waiting to see what 200 years of grief would do when it finally came face to face with something as small, as simple, and as human as a lopsided cake and a handwritten wish nobody had dared to offer her in 2 centuries. The Empress knelt. It happened so suddenly that several guards flinched, unprepared for the sight of their ruler, lowering herself to the same level as a human technician on the cold floor of her own throne room. Up close, I could see the fine lines around her eyes were not merely decorative markings like Counselor Oren's, but something closer to old scars, faint silver traces, where something long ago had cut deep enough to leave a permanent mark, even on a body that did not age the way mine did. 200 years, she whispered, so quietly that I barely caught the words, since anyone in this empire has dared write my name beside those 2 words. "I'm sorry it took this long," I said. "I really am." She reached out one hand, hovering just above the surface of the cake, not quite touching it, as though she expected it to vanish the moment her fingers made contact, as though joy itself might be some fragile illusion built to disappear the instant she reached for it. "When I was young," she said, and her voice carried a distant quality now, drifting somewhere far from the throne room, far from the guards, far from the 200 silent nobles watching this moment unfold. "My mother used to bake something similar, every year, on this very date, not out of tradition, not out of duty. Simply because she loved the day I was born, and she wanted the whole court to know it." I said nothing, sensing that this was not a moment that needed my words, only my silence. "The night everything ended," she continued, "there was a cake very much like this one, sitting on the feast table when the doors burst open. I remember staring at it while the screaming started, as if some part of me believed that as long as the cake remained untouched, the moment could somehow be paused, undone, reversed. It was not. Nothing that followed could be undone. Somewhere behind me, I heard several of the nobles shift uncomfortably, their eyes lowered, and I understood, in that moment, that many of them had likely lived through that same night, had likely carried their own version of that memory buried deep enough that nobody had ever dared speak of it aloud, not even after 2 centuries. "After that night," the Empress went on, "I forbade celebration on this date, in this hall, for as long as I lived. I told myself it was an act of respect toward the dead. But standing here now, I wonder if it was simply that I could not bear to see another cake on this table, ever again, without seeing the blood that followed it." "That makes sense," I said softly. "Nobody would blame you for that." "And yet," she said, finally letting her fingers rest against the edge of the plate, "here you stand, a creature from a species barely old enough to understand the weight of my empire's history, insisting that I deserve joy on this day, regardless of what came before it." "I think everyone deserves that," I said, "especially the people who've been carrying grief the longest." From somewhere near the back of the hall, a sharp voice cut through the moment like a blade. "This is madness." Every head turned toward the source, a tall, broad-shouldered Vantheon noble, stepping forward from the assembled crowd, his robes marked with deep crimson trim that set him apart from the muted colors worn by everyone else in the room. His eyes were narrowed with open contempt as he stared first at me, then at the Empress still kneeling on the floor beside the cake. "Counselor Doran Ashkar," Vesa Orin murmured beside me, low enough that only I could hear. "Second seat of the inner court. He has waited a long time for the Empress to show any sign of weakness he could exploit." "Your Majesty," Doran Ashkar said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "With the deepest respect, I must object. 2 centuries of tradition, of mourning observed with the utmost discipline, cannot simply be discarded because a human wandered uninvited into your presence carrying a piece of confectionery." "Careful, Counselor," Vesa Orin said, stepping forward now, her voice carrying its own quiet authority. "You forget yourself." "I forget nothing," Doran Ashkar snapped back. "I remember exactly what this day cost this empire, and I will not stand by while sentiment born of a lesser species' customs threatens to unravel 200 years of solemn tradition. Tradition that has held this court together through grief that would have shattered lesser rulers entirely." The Empress rose slowly to her feet, and the temperature in the room seemed to shift again, though this time the change came from her, not from the guards or the counselors watching every movement with held breath. "Tradition," she said, her voice carrying a new edge now, something sharper than the sorrow that had colored her words moments earlier, "was never meant to be a cage, Counselor. I built these walls of silence myself, in my own grief, believing they would protect what remained of my family's memory. I did not build them so that 2 centuries later, a member of my own court would use them as a weapon to control what I am and am not permitted to feel." Doran Ashkar's expression flickered, uncertainty creeping into his confidence for the first time. "Your Majesty, I only meant—" "I know precisely what you meant," she said, cutting him off with a coldness that made even Vesa Orin go very still beside me. "You have waited a long time for a reason, to remind this court that grief makes rulers predictable, controllable, easier to manage than joy ever could be. A ruler drowning in sorrow does not question the whispers fed to her by advisors eager to shape her decisions. A ruler who remembers she is still capable of feeling something other than sorrow is far more dangerous to men like you." The hall had gone utterly silent now, 200 nobles frozen in place, watching a confrontation 2 centuries in the making finally break the surface after so long buried beneath careful, practiced grief. "You will not tell me," the Empress continued, her voice rising now, carrying through every corner of that vast chamber, "that acknowledging the day of my birth somehow dishonors the memory of my family. My family loved me. My mother baked confections not unlike this one, every single year, because she wanted this hall to remember I was born into joy, long before it became a hall of mourning. You did not know her. You do not have the right to speak for what she would have wanted." Doran Ashkar said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking briefly toward the guards stationed near the throne, as if calculating whether this was a battle worth pursuing further. "Leave my sight," the Empress said quietly, and though her voice had dropped low again, it carried more weight in that quiet than it had in the shout before it. "We will speak of your conduct another day. Today belongs to something else entirely." For a long moment, Doran Ashkar did not move, and I felt the tension in the room stretch so tight it seemed ready to snap. Then, finally, he bowed stiffly, turned, and walked back through the crowd, disappearing through a side entrance without another word. The Empress turned back toward me, and something in her expression had changed completely. The ancient weariness still present, but softened now by something else, something that looked, impossibly, like the very beginning of relief. "You have caused a great deal of disruption today, Ethan Cole," she said. "I noticed," I admitted. A sound escaped her that I almost did not recognize at first, quiet, brief, and unmistakably close to laughter, the first genuine sound of amusement I suspected this hall had heard in longer than any living soul present could remember. 200 years, she said softly, looking down at the cake once more. And it takes a human, uninvited and entirely unprepared for the consequences of his own foolishness, to remind me that I am still permitted to feel something other than grief on this day. I think you were always allowed, I said. I just don't think anyone ever told you it was okay. She looked at me for a long moment, and then, slowly, deliberately, she reached down and broke off a small piece of the cake with her fingers, holding it up in front of the entire silent court. Then let it be known, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, that from this day forward, the anniversary of my ascension will no longer be observed in silence. And with that, in front of 200 stunned witnesses, Empress Sorrentha Vale, ruler of the Vantheon Dominion, tasted cake for the first time in 200 years. The reaction in the hall was immediate and impossible to contain. A wave of murmurs broke across the assembled nobles, some of shock, some of quiet disbelief, and here and there, faint and uncertain, the first sounds of something that might have been genuine relief. I watched an elderly Vantheon noblewoman near the front of the crowd press a hand to her mouth, her eyes bright with unshed tears, as though she too had been waiting 2 centuries for permission to feel something other than careful, practiced sorrow. Counselor Orin, the Empress said, turning toward Vesa with the faint remains of frosting still on her fingertips. See to it that Ethan Cole is treated as an honored guest of this court, not a prisoner awaiting judgment. At once, Your Majesty, Vesa Orin said, and I caught the faint trace of a smile pulling at the corner of her mouth, the first hint of warmth I had seen from her since the moment those black doors first opened. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since the shuttle first docked, my knees suddenly unsteady with the release of hours of held tension. Somewhere in my ear, faint and static, Nathan Price's voice broke through. Ethan, he said, his voice trembling with disbelief. Are you alive? Please tell me you're alive. I'm alive, I said quietly, unable to stop the small, disbelieving laugh that escaped me. Better than alive, actually. I watched the internal feed. I watched the whole thing. Ethan, I don't even know what to say to you right now. Say happy birthday, I said. To her, not to me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, before Nathan finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. I think you just changed something that's been frozen for 200 years. He wasn't wrong, though none of us fully understood yet exactly how far that change would spread. Within hours, word of what had happened aboard the Sovereign's Requiem began traveling through Vantheon channels faster than anyone could contain it. Nobles who had witnessed the moment firsthand spoke of it in hushed, astonished tones to family members stationed on other worlds. Guards who had stood watch that day found themselves retelling the story to soldiers who had not been present, each retelling adding new weight to what had already felt, to those of us standing in that hall, like something enormous. By the following morning, Station Command on Meridian had already received 3 separate diplomatic inquiries from Vantheon outposts, each one asking, with careful, formal language that barely disguised genuine curiosity, whether the reports were true, whether a human had truly stood before the Empress uninvited, whether she had truly broken 2 centuries of silence over a simple cake. I spent that first night in a guest chamber aboard the flagship, still half convinced I would wake to find myself back on the shuttle, none of it having actually happened. Laura Bennett found a way to send a message through official channels the next morning, her voice cracking, somewhere between laughter and disbelief when she reached me. You absolute lunatic, she said. Do you have any idea what you did? Half the station thinks you're either a hero or the single most reckless person they've ever met. Probably both, I admitted, echoing the same words I had given Vesa Orin only a day earlier. The Empress requested the recipe, Ethan, the actual recipe, for my cake. I don't think I've ever been more terrified and more proud in the same conversation. 3 days later, I stood once again in that same throne room, though this time the atmosphere could not have felt more different. Sunlight, or the closest artificial equivalent the ship's systems could produce, streamed through wide viewports that had, until recently, remained shuttered on this particular date for as long as anyone could remember. The black stone floor, once cold and silent, now carried the low murmur of conversation, careful and restrained by centuries of habit, present, undeniably present, in a way it had not been before. Empress Sorrentha Vale sat upon her throne, though she no longer wore the same heavy formal robes from that first encounter. Something in her posture had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the weight she carried slightly less crushing than before. Ethan Cole, she said as I approached, and something in the way she said my name now carried none of the cold authority from our first meeting. I have decided that this date will be formally recognized within Vantheon custom from this year forward. Not as a day of mourning alone, nor as a day of celebration that ignores what was lost. Both, together, exactly as you described. I'm glad, I said, meaning it completely. I have also decided, she continued, that the human customs surrounding such occasions deserve further study. Counselor Oren has already begun compiling records on what your species refers to as birthdays, and their significance across your history. That sounds like Vesa, I said, glancing toward the counselor standing near the base of the throne, who offered the faintest hint of a smile in response. There is something else, the Empress said, and something in her tone made me straighten slightly, sensing this was not simply ceremonial conversation. Counselor Doran Ashkar has been removed from his seat on the inner court, effective immediately. An investigation into decades of quiet manipulation within this council has already begun, manipulation that relied heavily on maintaining an atmosphere of unbroken sorrow within these halls, an atmosphere that made it easier for him and others like him to steer decisions without meaningful challenge. I felt a chill at that, understanding suddenly just how much more this moment had disturbed than a single tradition. He's not going to let that go quietly, I said. No, the Empress agreed. He will not. Which is precisely why security around this court, and around you specifically for as long as you remain aboard this vessel, has been increased considerably. Do not mistake the warmth of this occasion for the absence of danger, Ethan Cole. You have disrupted something far larger than a single tradition. You have disrupted a balance of power that certain individuals have relied upon for far longer than either of us fully understands yet. As if summoned by her words, the doors at the far end of the hall opened suddenly, and a guard rushed in, his usual disciplined composure replaced by something closer to alarm. Your Majesty, he said, breathless. We have detected an unauthorized transmission, originating from the private quarters, previously assigned to Counselor Ashkar. Security teams are moving to intercept, but preliminary scans suggest the signal was directed toward an unregistered vessel, currently approaching from the outer perimeter. The temperature in the room shifted instantly, 200 years of careful discipline snapping back into place, as guards moved toward defensive positions along the walls, weapons raised, the earlier warmth of the gathering replaced by something sharper, more immediate. Identify the vessel, Vesa Oren said sharply. Working on it now, Counselor. Initial signature matches a known smuggling frigate, previously linked to fringe elements opposed to the Crown's current administration. The Empress rose from her throne, her earlier softness hardening back into the same cold authority I had first encountered, though something in her eyes now carried purpose rather than simple grief. Bring me a full report the moment that vessel is identified, she said, and ensure Ethan Cole is moved to a secured section of this ship immediately. Wait, I said, stepping forward despite the guard already moving to escort me away. If this is connected to what happened here, to what I did, then I should be part of figuring out what happens next. I didn't come this far just to be hidden away the moment things got complicated. The Empress studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, an acknowledgement passing silently between us. Very well, she said finally. Stay. But you will follow every instruction given to you without hesitation. This is no longer a matter of birthdays and cake, Ethan Cole. This is a matter of an empire realizing, perhaps for the first time in 2 centuries, that grief carefully maintained by those in power can just as easily be a tool of control as it can be a genuine wound. Over the following hour, reports filtered in steadily. The unregistered frigate had altered course upon detection, retreating back toward the outer perimeter, rather than risking direct confrontation with the Sovereign's Requiem's considerably superior defenses. Security teams confirmed that the transmission from Ashkar's former quarters had indeed been intended to reach that vessel, though the exact content of the message remained encrypted, under active analysis by the ship's intelligence division. He was building an exit plan, Vesa Oren said grimly, studying the reports alongside the Empress. Likely for some time now. Today's events simply forced his hand earlier than he intended. Or forced him to accelerate something already in motion, the Empress said. Either way, we now know with certainty that his influence over this court ran deeper than mere political ambition. There are others sympathetic to his position still seated within these halls. This will require careful, deliberate action in the days ahead. I stood quietly through much of this, aware that I had stumbled into something far larger than a simple act of kindness, though I found myself, strangely, without regret. Whatever storm followed, whatever danger Doran Ashkar and those aligned with him still posed, the moment in that hall 3 days earlier had been real. The cake had been real. The Empress's laughter, brief and disbelieving as it was, had been real. By evening, as the artificial light along the ship's corridors dimmed into its programmed simulation of nightfall, I found myself standing once more in the guest chamber I had been assigned, staring out through a wide viewport at the endless field of stars beyond the hull. A soft chime announced a visitor, and I turned to find Empress Sorrentha Vale standing in the doorway, without guards, without ceremony, dressed in simple dark robes far removed from the formal weight of her throne room attire. "May I enter?" she asked, and something in the question struck me as remarkable. An empress who had ruled absolutely for 2 centuries, quietly asking permission to step into a room. "Of course," I said. She stepped inside, moving to stand beside me at the viewport, her pale eyes fixed on the same endless stretch of stars. "I wish to thank you properly," she said, "away from the court, away from ceremony. What you did today was reckless, foolish, and by every rule of this empire, deserving of severe punishment." "I know," I said. "It was also," she continued, "the first genuinely kind thing anyone has done for me, in longer than I care to admit. I do not know how to properly express gratitude for something I had convinced myself I no longer deserved." "You don't have to," I said. "Just keep letting people say happy birthday to you from now on. That's more than enough." She was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars drift slowly past the viewport, and then, softly, almost hesitantly, as though testing whether the words still fit properly in her mouth after 2 centuries of disuse, she spoke again. "Thank you, Ethan Cole," she said, "for remembering that even an empress is still permitted to have a birthday worth celebrating." Outside the viewport, the stars continued their slow, silent drift, indifferent to empires, to grief, to the quiet, fragile beginnings of change, taking root in a throne room that had finally, after 200 years, remembered what it felt like to hope for something other than sorrow. And somewhere far behind us, aboard a retreating frigate now vanishing into the dark beyond the perimeter, Doran Ashkar was already beginning to plan his return. But that was a story for another day. Tonight, for the first time in 2 centuries, the Sovereign's Requiem carried something other than silence through its halls. It carried the quiet, unmistakable sound of an empire beginning to heal.